You may have heard the name Anthony Ray Hinton. Of course, you might not have. He's not a household name, but he's gotten notoriety for spending 28 years on death row in Alabama for a crime that he did not commit. It's obvious that he didn't commit it because he wasn't there when it happened. 2 fast food restaurant managers were killed in 1986. And that night, it was clear that he was at work at a warehouse. He had punched in and out, and the guards had seen him. But in a memoir that he wrote called The Sun Does Shine, it becomes clear what happened. He was poor, so he didn't have his own attorney. He got a court-appointed attorney who wasn't very good. And it's a system about racism and a lot of brokenness, but beyond all that, there's a big old-fashioned sin right in the middle of it all. And that is that 2 people were willing to lie under oath that he was there that night. And it was so hard for him to believe it because one of the people who lied was someone whose sister he used to date. And that brother didn't like him because of the way the 2 of them broke up. And so that was payback for breaking up with his sister. 28 years on death row. And we're hearing about a court scene in the first reading that is really important because it's a view of Peter that we may not necessarily be used to. All of us who come to church on Good Friday or on Palm Sunday, we're used to hearing another way of Peter testifying. But today, he is being scolded by the high court of the Jews. We told you to stop preaching about Jesus. He was executed for good reason. You should not be preaching about him. We've told you before, cut it out. And yet you still are proclaiming his name. And Peter said, I would like to please you, Your Honor, but the truth is in conflict with what you're saying. And I'm not going to choose you over the truth. And further, I'm needing to please God in my life. If I have to choose between pleasing God or pleasing you, I'm going to choose God every time. Which is a remarkable change for Peter. In fact, it says that as the court threw them out and reprimanded them, Peter and the other apostles rejoiced that they were able to suffer dishonor for the sake of Jesus. We were delighted to suffer dishonor for his sake. That is a remarkable thing for the man who, as we hear every Palm Sunday and every Good Friday, swore on his own name that he didn't even know Jesus. And Jesus overheard that. This man now says, I feel thrilled, I feel blessed to be persecuted, to be dishonored for Jesus. One of the things Peter is teaching us is that a mark of love is a willingness to suffer dishonor for the sake of one that you love. He's willing to make a fool out of himself for Jesus. And he doesn't necessarily need to get attention for it, but it just is natural because his focus is so focused like a laser beam on Jesus. In the gospel, when he's in the boat and hears Jesus out on the water, realizes who it is, he doesn't hesitate for a second. He runs off the boat like a madman and jumps in the water. This is a moment where he doesn't care at all what anybody thinks. He's not worried about how that looks. He's not worried if people will think he's a fool. He is focused on Jesus like a dog who can smell a porterhouse on the kitchen counter. Nothing else matters. He is focused totally on Jesus. And one of the things that we learn in this story is that the best way for us to suffer dishonor for the love of someone is by being willing to suffer the dishonor of admitting when we've made a mistake and need to make amends. We need to recognize that the discomfort, the dishonor that comes from saying, I am wrong, I was wrong about that, I was on the wrong side of this and I'm sorry, I know I hurt you, and I want to make it up to you, that is the kind of dishonor that shows love. The dishonor we are willing to suffer to admit, I was wrong. One of the things that does no favor to our young people is when we're not honest with them about some of the struggles that we've had earlier in life. It can be kind of common for people to say, oh, when I was your age, I would never have done that. I would never have talked to my mother like that. I would never have stayed out late like that. Not like you kids. And in some cases that might have been true because of a context. But in general, we do no favors to our children if we don't admit, I know what that's like. I've struggled with that too. And it's not just parents. I know it as a priest. The homilies that I get the most feedback on are the ones where I admit to you that I am struggling with that same thing. That I have days in a Starbucks where I just want to annihilate everybody, and I'm sitting there like mimicking them under my breath. End of story, for those of you who remember that homily. And I know that you do because you quote it back to me quite often. When we can admit, I have struggles. This is hard for me. My virtue is tested with this too. We do so much more for people than when we try to hold it all in. There was a study recently published that shows that teachers who are willing to admit their weaknesses and their mistakes to their students are far more effective than the teachers who try to cover all that up. A teacher who says, this one's hard for me. I hope I get this right. Let me review this. I've reviewed this a couple of times and I find this concept hard, so bear with me. A teacher like that gets so much more traction with their students than one who always feels like they have to be the authority no matter what and convince everybody that their word is gospel. In fact, one of the most important parts of learning is tolerating not knowing for a while until you can understand later. A teacher who's willing to admit that they have weaknesses or that they've made mistakes, they're showing students that it's okay to not know until you do know. It's okay to stumble on the road to understanding. That's part of what learning involves. And I will tell you that I visit a lot of elderly people as part of my work in the parish, and the elderly people who impress me the most, and there are many of them, are the ones who will say, Father, I can't believe this, but I'm 95 years old and I still learn something new every day. The people who admit that, that's an elder. That's a wise one who says life is all about learning. It's not about knowing. We're never fully the expert. We're always a student of whatever it is, because there's always more to know. Peter shows us that we have to be willing to suffer dishonor by admitting our weaknesses and our flaws, and by being willing to make amends for them. That is one of the hallmarks of love. And Jesus, in response, teaches us another lesson, one of the hardest and best lessons of all. He shows us what it looks like to let it go and forgive. After what happened on Good Friday, I don't think any of us would have blamed Jesus if he was a little chilly to Peter after he resurrected from the dead. Couldn't you understand if Jesus was like, oh, hello there. How are you? How have you been? Right? And nobody would have blamed him. After all, on his way to the cross, he heard Peter who said, I'll ride or die for you, Lord. I'll be there no matter what. He heard him deny him 3 times and do it under oath. And Jesus was even lonelier on the cross because of that than he would have been. And yet, he does not hold any grudge against Peter. He does not treat him any differently than the other apostles. He meets him with the same amount of love, and he lets it go. Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent 28 years on death row, was released in 2015. Unbelievably, this fact shocked me. He was the 152nd person in our country to be released from death row after being found innocent. Shocking number of people. He was interviewed after he was released, and the reporter asked, "What do you do with all the bitterness?" And he said, "I don't have any bitterness." He said, "I can't." He said, "I forgive the state of Alabama." He said, "Because they already took 28 years of my life, and I'm not going to give them one more day." That's forgiveness. That's what it means to say, my losses are gone, but I'm not going to give you one more day of it. I'm going to let it go. Recently, I was meeting with a family to prepare for their father's funeral, and he was a beloved dad, great role model, and the kids loved him and are brokenhearted to lose him. One of the questions I asked them was, what is a lesson that you have learned from your dad's life? And one of his kids said, "Oh, he taught me so much about generosity. He taught me about humbleness and hard work and perseverance." And it was all beautiful and true. And then I asked the other child, now an adult, "What lesson did your dad's life teach you?" And he said, "Not to hold grudges." And I said, "Oh, your dad didn't hold grudges?" And he said, "No, he did." And it made his life harder than it needed to be. Sometimes I would be sitting there with my 85-year-old dad, and a name of a basketball coach from high school would come up, and he'd get all mad again, and it wasn't fair, and he didn't let me play, or whatever it was. And he said, "I learned I don't want to live like that. It's too hard. I don't want to hold grudges. I'll do whatever it takes to let go." Last week, Jesus met Thomas exactly where he was at and helped him with the exact needs that he had out of love. And this week, he's doing the same thing with Peter, who's in a very different place, but Jesus meets him exactly where he's at. Love does that. That's how love works. Love revisits. Love admits. Love forgives. Love suffers dishonor if needed. Love never fails.